I'm trying to recall interesting things from my like political news feed this morning, uh, that aren't just like, oh, the poll data said this. You know what? Actually, no. Hold on. I have an idea. I could talk about how much I fucking hate polling, because I do. I really hate it. Political scientists oftentimes do polling. Oops. Which is the practice of sampling a certain amount of the population to see which candidate or which party is likely to win in the election, right? In Europe, this can work. In fact, it routinely works pretty well in Europe from what I've seen, because in Europe there are yeah. So in Europe, a lot of countries have laws that either make it easier to vote or harder to not vote, right? So very frequently in European countries, you get high turnout, with some exceptions, like the French presidential election just this year actually had if I'm not mistaken in my memory, a record low turnout of 30% because people did not like either candidate. But in the United States, no such laws exist, or at least they didn't used to until recently. There is early voting, which I do every time it's an election season. I get my ballot in the mail, I vote, I drop it in the mail. You know, that's how I do it. But in the United States, the best turnout we usually get is about 60%. 60% of the eligible voting population votes in the most high-profile election, in the presidential election. You know, most visible office in the country, we only get 60% turnout. For legislative elections, like midterms, you get 40, maybe 50% turnout. So it is a very small plurality of people, if that. It is a minority of people that determine. Oh, bro, the new follow sound is working. Thank you for the follow. So in the United States, a minority of people determines the makeup of the national legislature, and as well the state legislatures, the local legislatures, state executive, local executive, because people don't fucking vote in this country. And what polls do is they sample the likely voters. So in the United States, polling data is like, oh, such and such candidate has this much support, such and such candidate has this much support. That's not actually how much support they will have in the election. That is not a good prediction of what the election will say, because no poll accounts for the possibility that people will vote who wouldn't otherwise. Every time you see like, oh, Democrats are projected to gain or lose this much seats, and Republicans are projected to gain or lose this much seats. That is based off of the people that do vote, and they mention nothing of people who don't. And by doing that, what they're doing to the people that don't vote is turning them off. Granted, in the United States, it is actually decently difficult to vote already, because voting day is not a day that you are allowed to get off necessarily. People don't get voting day off in the United States. There's no only very recently have we started to do like automatic voter registration, or even like more expansive mail-in voting and stuff like that. Basically, in the U.S., it's known that this is the place where it's not easy to vote. But polling organizations, political science, people who do polling, don't talk about that. They only talk about the people that do vote, right? And the people who vote are diehards. And in fact, there are more diehards on the right than there are on the left. So when pollsters are like, let's go do a poll, first they're sampling the same people every time. Each polling org has a group of like 1,000 or 2,000 people that they sample to do their polling. So every time you see XYZ%, support for this person, you're only seeing what about 3,000 or 4,000 people think. You're not seeing anything representative necessarily of the entire population. Maybe the voting bloc, yes, but very frequently what I think happens is they put out a poll that says, oh, Like, oh, this outcome isn't maybe as good as we would like it to be. And then people who don't ordinarily vote see that and say, well, if that's how it is, I'm just not going to vote because what the fuck does my vote matter? And you know what? They're right. Because the polling places, by predicting certain outcomes, makes them more likely to happen. By predicting this candidate will win, they make it more likely that that candidate will win because fewer people will vote for that candidate. In Europe, this isn't as much the case because voter turnout doesn't depend on the polls. You guys generally have pretty high turnout already in the regions of 70 to 90% routinely, at least for the most high profile elections. But in the United States, that shit matters because we don't have a coherent legal system around ensuring that people are able to vote. So polling places and polling groups are one of the many elements of like the mass media cycle that actually influences an election, but they pretend that they don't, and everybody like takes that shit as fact. And this is where the benefit of political science actually comes in, is because if you don't do as much polling, if you focus more on getting people to vote than the actual polling itself, the result changes. There have been voter drives in the U.S. Stacey Abrams in Georgia, her whole thing is like a progressive get out the vote campaign. She wants people to go out there and vote because democracy dies if you don't participate in it. Democracy depends on you participating. But polling dissuades participation. At least the expansive polling that we have with as sparsely populated voter blocks as we have. To go back to the issue of elections, that's why I hate the institution of polling in the United States, especially because it actually didn't used to be like this, if you can believe it. In the 1990s, this was a new thing. Bill Clinton ran his campaign and actually sort of changed the political landscape based on how he ran it. First of all, he started the trend of everybody's a conservative. He started the political trend where if you're running for office, you have to run as a conservative, otherwise your party will reject you. The electorate won't reject you. In fact, the electorate likes people who are left of center, but the party insiders hate like anybody left of dead center, and that's because of Bill Clinton and his campaign. The second thing that he did was he really ramped up the amount of polling that people did. But oh, that's right, the Clinton campaign. He said like, usually there was one or two polls leading up to the election. Like there'd be a poll on the actual day of the election to be like, oh, this is the result that we can expect. And then they'd test it by like the election and they'd see how good their methods were. What Bill Clinton's campaign started doing was just pumping out polls left and right. And that actually led to lower fidelity of polling data. I remember in 2016, the polls were wrong. Not just like, they were a little bit off. They were outside of the margin of error. This is what a social scientist would call a bad poll. And every poll since then has had the potential, the very real potential, to be a bad poll. Like, to get more specific, in 2016, I think the projections were like Hillary Clinton would beat Donald Trump by something like 6 percentage points. Where if the whole vote adds up to 100%, if everybody who voted is 100%, Hillary Clinton would get 53%. No, not 6%. It was like 9 percentage points. Hillary would get like 54-ish%, and Trump would get 45%. Right, that was the projection going into 2016. But what happened was Hillary Clinton got 65 million votes and Trump got 62 million. That's only like 51 to 49. And that's instead of a 9-point gap, that's a 2-point gap. And Trump won that election because the presidential election isn't decided by the popular vote. It's decided by the quote-unquote electoral college. And that always skews against the popular vote. It can sometimes align with it, but so that poll predicted a 9-point gap, but was 7 points off. In social science, your poll has to be within 5%. That was a bad poll. And a lot of polls have been like that since that time. So we're sort of, like, by polling so much, we're shooting ourselves in the foot each election. Because we keep getting the candidate that's, like, has a rap sheet a mile long. And not a good rap sheet either. Anywho. And on a similar subject to voting, I would like to actually continue my rant about polling that I did last stream. So, there's one thing about polling that I want to focus on, or actually two things, and that is what I call the horse race effect, or what I'm going to call the horse race effect for this purpose of this rant, and scattershot disinformation, or misinformation, whichever you prefer. First, I will go with the horse race approach, or the horse race effect. Because of how frequent polling is, right, leading up to an election in the United States, polling being super frequent trivializes the upcoming election. You know, it makes people think, oh, well, you know, it doesn't matter. There's always going to be another horse race to bet on, right? It's almost like people sort of guessing, it's like commentators guessing how a horse race will turn out. You know, pollsters can get famous off their polls if they get picked up by a news outlet. It's like, oh, you correctly predicted the outcome of this election. Like, how did you do it? How are you so smart and big brain? You know, there's all that. And the trivialization of politics, the trivialization of elections, turns people off from voting. However, it is only a certain group of people that gets turned off. So, when Republicans see a poll, regardless of if it's for their candidate, then great, I'm going to go out and support them for America and blah, 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 blah. If it shows their candidate as losing, then, oh, that's fake news, they're going to win anyway. Republicans are not affected by polls. Like, they see those polls and it doesn't affect whether or not they vote. However, mainstream liberals and Democrats are affected. If your average sort of liberal type sees a poll that looks bad for the candidate that they prefer, it's a very real possibility that they give up and don't vote as a result of, like, voter apathy or whatever. So on that front, because of the way that polling gets trivialized, or that polling trivializes American elections, polling favors the most rabid elements of the Republican Party. It helps them. So that's one part of it. It trivializes elections, which turns off the mainstream, your average person who's not likely to vote, and that helps fascists, right? Because when you turn the whole thing into a game, people are going to believe it's a game. But then the second part, the scattershot misinformation aspect of like the rampant polling leading up to an election, is as follows. Polls 6 months out from an election and polls the eve of an election will look nothing alike. And they, you could get one end of the likelihood spectrum and the other end with everything in between. And the consequence of that, or the reason for that, is that pollsters and polling groups, places that do political polling, want to cover their asses. So if they get something wrong, they can simply say, oh no, but look, we got it right in this other one. And people won't hound them for it. So as a result, they do a scattershot. They predict every single outcome possible. And they put that out as the latest and greatest poll of like, we got it, this is what's going to happen. No, wait, this is going to happen. This is what's going to happen. No, this other thing is going to happen. Over and over and over and over again. And it could be a different thing every week, sometimes even on a daily basis. Polls can change. And there is actually another country that does this. It is not, but it's not with polling. Russia does this with its international propaganda networks. they do what's called a scattershot approach to misinformation, or in the case of Russia, disinformation. You know, they put out any and every possible interpretation to try and muddy the waters. And it fucking works. And in this case, you know, even if the pollsters have like good intentions or whatever, however much you could even, you know, put a measurement to that, the outcome is the same. The waters get muddied and nobody knows what the real outcome actually is, or what the like real prediction is or will be. So in that way, polling, the modern iteration of polling as an institution, is harmful to democracy. I know it sounds weird to say because it's like, well, isn't this being done by political scientists? Yes, but they're all buying into it. Like hook, line, and sinker, they buy into the trivialization of politics by doing this. You know, it would actually be better if you didn't do any polling leading up to the election, so that people went in blind, completely blind, just knowing this is who's on the ballot, this is what their platform is. That should be the only knowledge that somebody goes into an election with. But unfortunately, it's not. And people want to bet on the winning horse. Most people in the United States do not have a coherent moral framework. They don't have like a very well-defined philosophical understanding of what is right and wrong, whatever that philosophy may be, right? However much I would disagree with it. Most people are not so coherent and not so politically involved as to pick a candidate based on their platform. No, what they do is they see the letter next to somebody's name. They see their appearances on television sometimes, and what else they see is the percent in the polls. They see who's the winning horse and who's the losing horse. And people in America like to win in a superficial sense, so they will bet on the winning horse, even if it means in a substantive sense they lose. Honestly, there are so many better things as well that political scientists could be doing. They could be studying the impact of certain policies. They could be studying which political issues, you know, are more likely to be substantively addressed by such or such, you know, policy. In the United States, they could analyze who is, you know, which party is better at addressing these systemic issues or these, you know, issues. Who's better at making sure people have food on the table? Who's better at making sure your kids are, you know, getting a good education? Who is better at ensuring that once your kids have an education, they're able to get a job? But they don't. They don't. I mean, some of them do, but, you know, the people who are doing polling nonstop are not the people doing the meaningful research. Hell, just do some demographics shit. Like, demographics seems, you know, kind of superficial to me, understanding, like, the nature of systemic issues and how they, you know, they affect everybody, but, like...